Welcome to the News Roundup for Wednesday, December 31st, 2025. I'm Bill Thomas. Happy New Year, and here's what's happening right now. President Trump now pointing the finger at Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and accusing her of directly being a low-life scammer who's playing a major role in the massive Somali fraud scheme plaguing her state. More troubling revelations from Minnesota. Officials now claiming that the state's current faulty election policy is allowing a colossal amount of voter fraud to take place, potentially impacting who takes office. And on Capitol Hill, the calls are growing louder for Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to travel to Washington and testify before Congress as part of their expanding probe into his administration's utter failure to stop the enormous theft of taxpayer money. Also, the war drums are thundering in Communist China following a belligerent and antagonistic New Year's Eve speech by leader Xi Jinping. And it's the end of an era as a legendary television network shuts down its last remaining music-only channel. All this and a bunch more coming up right now on the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin with this. The heat is rising rapidly on Representative Ilhan Omar for her role in downplaying and obscuring the massive welfare fraud scandal, which is allegedly being perpetrated by many of her Somali constituents. And now it's coming straight from the top. Yeah, the way I see it, the gloves are most definitely off. President Trump is ratcheting up the pressure on Ms. Omar even further and now flat out accusing the Congresswoman of being one of many scammers from Somalia who are profiting from those fraud schemes. In a blistering social media post, the president rages that 90% of the Minnesota fraud is being committed by people who came to our country illegally from Somalia, which he calls the most corrupt country on the planet. Then goes on to call Congresswoman Omar a constantly complaining and ungrateful loser who contributes nothing to our society before adding that lowlifes like her and her fellow Somalis can only ever be a liability to our country's greatness. Almost sounds like he's sort of kind of not fond of her. Taking it a step further, the president then suggests that the best course of action would be to send them all back to where they came from. And apparently, this time I think he really means it. The White House is now confirming that the entire administration is currently looking into how they can legally revoke the U.S. citizenship of any Somali Americans who are ultimately convicted of committing fraud. They also say that right now, the federal government is executing a large number of search warrants and subpoenas directly related to the alleged crimes, that they soon expect to round up a lot of new offenders, and that moving forward, they're going to do their best to use denaturalization proceedings to kick them right out of the country. In the meantime, Omar says that both she and her fellow Somali immigrants consider themselves just as American as anyone else, that they're all protected by the U.S. Constitution, true that, and that in the end they know they're not going anywhere. Additionally, she continues to deny and deflect any and all charges against her, including allegations that she once actually married her own brother. And for the record, she calls those claims absurd and offensive, but everybody's talking about it. She's also pushing back against critics who allege that her astronomical leak in net worth may somehow be related to the enormous fraud taking place in her very own congressional district. Now, for the record, I've never alleged that. I may have alluded to it, but I never alleged it. And final thought, this is what we call the News Roundup Lowdown. Here's the bottom line, the way I see it anyway. Billions of hard-earned taxpayer dollars have literally vanished into thin air, Minnesota thin air. And while investigations still ongoing, dozens of scoundrels have already been convicted of fraud. And the way we see it, more convictions are on the way. Tons of that fraud happened in Ilhan Omar's 5th District, and rather than hunker down, address the issue, and effect a fix, she's redirecting. Like a lawyer, deflecting, and coming off as delusional. And she even claims that President Donald J. Trump is creepy and obsessed with her. Now, look, 47 has a number of pressing issues to tend to every second of every day, trying to hold the planet together, and the last thing he's obsessed with is that woman. She's simply trying to take you off the trail, off of her failures, and blame her ineffective leadership and incompetence on somebody else. Essentially, the president is doing something today, right now, which the ungrateful Congresswoman refuses to do, and that's get to the bottom of what happened. Find out who's ultimately responsible and do everything in his power to put a stop to it. First in Minnesota and then all over the country. Hey, simply put, the gravy train's about to run out of steam, and every taxpayer across the nation appreciates what the Trump administration is doing to stop crooks from raiding the government till. That's your money and my money as well. And by the way, if you support the administration in their efforts to hold people accountable, leave a comment for us, and we'd like to know what you're thinking. I know what I'm thinking, and I think we're probably on the same page. Turning now to shocking allegations that the enormous fraud scandal, which is currently plaguing Minnesota, could actually be so widespread that it's actually affecting the outcome of statewide elections. According to reports, lawmakers are now zeroing in on a controversial election policy in the North Star State, Minnesota, which allows registered voters to vouch for up to 8 other people and allow them all to sign up for same-day voter registration, and all without any sort of reliable proof that they actually live there. So, the rule requires the prospective new voter to show some type of ID to show who they are, including their current driver's license. However, there's not much in the policy that makes them verify where they actually live, other than the trusted word of the person who's vouching for them. Well, what could possibly go wrong? Once again, critics are pointing directly to Governor Tim Walz and blaming his policies for the mess. They say his 2023 driver's licenses for all bill allows just about anyone to get an ID, whether they're here legally or not, further opening the door to additional fraud in his state. Fine job there, Governor Timmy. Voting rights experts now say that Minnesota's current voting policy leaves the state extremely vulnerable to exploitation. They point out that between 2022 and 2024, Minnesota rejected only 54 voter registrations out of a total of more than 1.3 million. And as you can imagine, that's far below even the lowest state average, and leaving critics to wonder if they bother vetting anybody at all. And I don't think they do. According to one leading conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, Minnesota already has the highest incidence rates of voter fraud in the entire country. Now, to make things worse, a number of recent voter fraud cases directly linked to the state's Somali community, including one man who signed as a witness to more than a dozen absentee ballots, even though he wasn't even a U.S. citizen. And for their part, as can be expected, state officials say that voter fraud in Minnesota is still extremely rare, that most of the data used by their critics is extremely old, and that their vouching policy, it's mostly used by senior citizens who've recently relocated to retirement facilities. In the meantime, they're now facing a federal lawsuit demanding broad access to all of their current voter information. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. A room full of the most talented writers in Hollywood, California. They could never have written this script. And if they tried, nobody would have bought it because it's all just too implausible. However, like they say, truth is oftentimes stranger than fiction or friction. No, I'm pretty sure it's fiction. I can't be sure. But here's the deal. For now, all we know about the monumental level of fraud in marvelous Minnesota, fraud to the tune of $9 billion. And now the hits, they just keep on coming with reported misdeeds in the election racket. Permitting one registered voter to vouch for 8 additional voters or more makes Minnesota sound mildly like a corrupt system, intentionally designed to rig the vote. Nobody minds if you rock the vote or even rock the boat, but ease off on rigging the elections. You might think it's no big deal if you don't live in Minnesota, but this is happening right now in a state run by Tim Walz, who almost became vice president, that is, of the United States of America. And had he been elected second in command, think of what could have happened all across the country, nationwide. This is a big deal. On every imaginable level, each of us should be enormously frightened by what's happening in a magical place called Walz land, because if it can happen there, perhaps it could happen in your home state as well. And the way I see it, this has all the makings of either an enormously funny sitcom or a tragically frightening horror movie. Editor Pranav the Magnificent, should we be afraid?
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
I'm kind of afraid right now. Staying on topic a bit longer now and turning our attention to the rapidly escalating federal investigation into Governor Tim Walz and his administration's disgraceful handling of the staggering Minnesota fraud scandal. The House Oversight Committee now says that in just a few days, they plan on holding the first of a number of critical hearings on Capitol Hill, all to get a better handle on the exact scale of the fraud damage. They also say the proceedings help them determine whether or not the Walz administration could have actually stopped those scams from happening happening in the first place. Well, yeah, that's his job. He's the governor. For his part, committee chair James Comer says the probe into Walz and his cronies is part of his civic duty as a member of Congress. Also says that if they want to get to the bottom of this mess, it's members of the Walz administration who hold all the answers, and right now. Comer goes on to say that both Governor Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison have either been totally asleep at the wheel or else they're directly complicit in the fraud itself. And I've been saying that for several days right here on the program. I think they've been monitoring me. He also says the American people, they deserve and demand for them to take accountability for the theft of their hard-earned tax money. Meanwhile, some members of Congress now demanding answers straight from the horse's mouth, saying that Republicans must force Governor Walz himself to travel to Washington and testify before the committee. Governor Walz, come on down. They also say that if he refuses the police power of the executive branch, it may be called into play. Now, for their part, Walz and his team continue to downplay the entire affair. Yeah, of course they do. They say that while they're always happy to work with Congress, this particular committee has a track record of holding circus hearings. No, they don't. That they have nothing to do with the matter at hand. It really does. And they also claim that while Governor Walz has been doing his best to put fraudsters behind bars, President Trump has been busy selling pardons to let them all back out. That's called Deflection 101, and I know you know about it. In the meantime, the Trump administration has finally had enough of the governor's hot air. And despite claims that the most recent daycare fraud accusations are unfounded, they're now freezing federal child care funding to every state in the entire nation. And all thanks to Minnesota. Thanks again, Governor Tim. Heck of a guy. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. Over the past several weeks, thousands of people, they've left comments for us right here on this channel, wondering when the feds are going to yank Tim Walz out of his palatial estate, the governor's mansion, paid for by, taxpayers in the state, and bring him in for a little chat and chew. Yeah, they'll give him a plate of meatloaf and a glass of buttermilk and a biscuit, and then shine the floodlights in his beady little eyes and force the truth out of him. You're under oath, Pops. Hey, look, maybe he'll take part, maybe he won't. But the feds are looking very closely at this guy. The whole country has gotten gypped. The way I see it, the fellow who's in charge of that state has some hardcore explaining to do. By the way, tons of folks are saying that the governor should be immediately arrested. And as I've said time and time again right here, there's a bit more to it than that. Formal charges, then the arrest, and trials, convictions, and so on. It's a goofy little thing they call due process. I'm not a real lawyer, but I do play one on this podcast from time to time. And at the very least, they ought to force that guy to take a minimum wage job scrubbing floors and bathrooms in one of those pretend daycare centers. Pay him minimum wage and make him work till the $9 billion in fraud has been paid back. In other words, don't get back at somebody, get even. It's much better. All right, we'll shift gears now and pivot to some alarming developments concerning a significant display of warmongering from the Chinese Communist regime. In his annual New Year's Eve speech, China's leader Xi Jinping vowed to recapture Taiwan by any means necessary, saying that his country's inevitable reunification with their motherland is now completely unstoppable. So, Xi made his provocative comments just hours after the communist regime wrapped up an extensive series of live-fire military exercises around their island neighbor, which were designed to send a shiver of intimidation down everyone's spine. According to experts, those drills also came in direct response to a recent $11 billion weapon sale from the U.S. to Taiwan. Now, during the rest of his message, Xi went on to claim that China continues to embrace the entire world with open arms, showed images from his country's biggest, largest ever military parade, and pointed to his country's growing friendship with Russia, North Korea, and Turkey as evidence of his nation's ongoing economic success. Yeah, but he's palling around with thugs. Now, some additional headlines we are keeping a very close watch on here in the News Roundup newsroom. First, officials are now confirming that Zoran Mamdani will be the first New York City mayor to be sworn into office using the Quran, saying that the 34-year-old socialist plans on using 3 different sets of Islam's holy book to take his solemn oath during a number of private and public ceremonies. Moving along, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is now planning a massive $100 million wartime recruitment push to hire a number of new deportation agents. ICE says they'll soon be launching an enormous advertising campaign aimed directly at military buffs and supporters of the Second Amendment. And in Florida, President Trump is welcoming in the new year by boasting about the great job he's doing. 47 bragging that despite any claims to the contrary, his true job approval rating now stands at a whopping 64%. Now, I recently heard it was 44%, but like they say, 64 is the new 44. And now a quick gander at a bit of rock and roll showbiz news. And we kick things off today with a remarkable update concerning a chart-topping pop classic from the 1980s. In his massive hit, We Didn't Start the Fire, legendary piano man Billy Joel rattles off the names of 59 people who are well-known pop culture luminaries. But surprisingly, following the recent passing of actress Brigitte Bardot, only 3 of them are still alive, including musicians Bob Dylan and Chubby Checker. You know, the funny thing is, even Billy Joel says that his least favorite song, one of his songs, is We Didn't Start the Fire, which he described as one of his worst songs ever. And I gotta agree. This guy's had a ton of hits over the years, and this was actually one of them. But melodically, it doesn't really measure up to all the rest. Also, I guess kind of the point of the story is, if Billy Joel ever mentions you in one of his songs, you might die. I guess that's the point. I can't be sure. And while we're on the subject of good tunes, the most popular music network of all time is about to throw in the towel. Call it a day. Just 44 years after hitting the airwaves, MTV finally pulling the plug on its last remaining wall-to-wall music channel, slamming the door shut on a remarkable era in pop culture. Final curtain call for the big music channel, and no longer will you see rock stars glaring into the camera and saying, I want my MTV.
I want my MTV!
I want my MTV.
I want my MTV. All right.
You know, if I recall accurately, the first song they played was Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. And now all those years later, kind of feels like YouTube and Spotify killed the MTV. As fun while it lasted, almost a half century. And breaking news from the Hollywood big top, actor George Clooney now confirming he's rounded up a bunch of the old gang once again for an upcoming new heist flick called Oceans 14. Among the returning crew members giving their thumbs up for the 4th film in the popular crime series, Julia Roberts, also young Bradley, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon, and all the rest. You know, it's the greatest movie news I've come across all day, maybe all month. Actually, if I think about it, maybe all year. A new Oceans picture with George Clooney putting the band back together once again. So you know in advance, this movie has a great plot. A bunch of old guys get together, rob a casino, and get away with it. A brilliant idea. I bet they win Oscar for most original screenplay.
You think we need one more? You think we need one more? All right, we'll get one more.
I just love those Clooney movies. And now it is time for us to call it a wrap on the big news roundup. So have an awesome day. Stay safe. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget that little subscribe button right there. It's easy to do. Also, once again, Happy New Year. With that, we'll dim the lights and fade to black, and we'll see you right back here next time for another edition of a brand new edition of the Big News Roundup.